I'm Lyndon Bradshaw, Queen of Chaos, Destruction, and Happiness. As many of you know, we lost a very heartfelt soul in the community a couple weeks ago, a true icon, a true community leader, and a friend to everyone, with the passing of George Bacon, editor-in-chief of Seattle Gay News since 1983. George was a force of nature and one to be reckoned with, who fought tirelessly for the LGBTQIA plus community here in Seattle. His love and his passion was felt through everybody who knew him. George, you will be missed.
Hello, I'm Tracy Leong with Cairo 7. As Seattle Pride's media partner, Cairo 7 is dedicated to raising awareness for inclusion and highlight issues directly impacting the LGBTQ community. I recently spoke to the Vashon Heritage Museum's historian Bruce Hallman about their thought-provoking exhibit, In and Out Being LGBTQ, on Vashon Island.
Well, the idea generated out of a workshop at Mohi on queering the museum, a movement that was taking place in the mid-2010s to sort of recognize sort of the diversity that many museums don't exhibit. And that's been something our museum has been trying to do. We've done a whole series of exhibits focusing on minority communities. We did an exhibit called Joy and Heartache, Japanese Americans on Vashon Island. We did an exhibit on the native people of Vashon Island. And so we're trying to recognize that traditional museums don't always tell the stories of all the constituents of the place they represent. And so that's been a major effort of ours, is to try and bring those stories into the museum and then have them reflected in the permanent exhibit. We're in the process of revising our permanent exhibit. And you don't get to do that very often. And when you do, having the chance to make sure that you tell the stories that have been excluded or have been overlooked in the past is very important to us. The title of this exhibit is In and Out Being LGBTQ on Vashon Island. So a recognition of the diversity of the LGBTQ community on Vashon.
Being a part of this process and seeing it develop over the years, how has that been for you?
Well, I'm a historian, so I love this stuff. And to see a community come together and to see the LGBTQ community on Vashon come together and try and find a way to tell the story of that community, it's very heartening. It's very encouraging, particularly in these times, you know, the times of Black Lives Matter that we're in right now. It's important to recognize that there are many stories out there that have not been told adequately, or have been, you know, suppressed. And it's important to tell those stories and to recognize what has happened to our community and our neighbors and our friends in the past. And I mean, the classic historian answer is that, you know, we do that so we don't do it again. You know, the old adage of if you forget the past, you're doomed to repeat it kind of thing. So it's very important, I think, for us to recognize the stories of all those marginalized people on our island and in the world in general.
Why is it important that, you know, for this generation and for generations to come, that we're having this dialogue? Why is it important that people know the history of the LGBTQ community on Vashon Island and all over the world?
Well, I think it's important because when stories are repressed, when people are subjugated and ignored, and there's prejudiced, violence used against them, it tends to suppress their humanity. And what we're really looking at here is just recognizing that LGBTQ community on Vashon, there are neighbors, there are friends, there are people that we work with. You know, they're everywhere, if you will, in the most positive kind of way. And they bring things to our community and to ourselves and our lives that are fundamental to being a diverse community. So I found on Vashon, I mean, the Vashon story is not untypical of the story in the broader United States and the Pacific Northwest. I mean, years and years of repression, years of generations of people just not speaking of LGBTQ people, and then years of repression. You know, loving somebody you love being illegal. and being persecuted for it, and being being attacked for it. I think it's important to understand that. And what brought it out to me was working with the advisory committee. We had a large advisory committee from the community. We had everybody from people in high school to people in their 80s working on this. And the dialogue between those folks was just fascinating, because young people who've grown up in a world where they've been accepted largely for who they are, it's difficult for them to recognize the fact that, 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 100 years ago, they couldn't be who they were without danger to themselves. And so there's sort of a recognition going on there. And for the older LGBTQ people to recognize that what they've been fighting for all their lives, they're beginning to see realizations of that. I mean, that's very powerful stuff.
Why was it important to make sure that the struggles and the triumphs and the challenges and just the, why was it important that that was all laid out, for people to see the transformation over time for this community and to see what they went through to get to today?
Right. Oh, to me, I mean, the most touching part of it to me is to put it in context of the Black Lives movement and the death of Floyd. That's been going on for years, and it's just this, it being caught on camera, it being so evident to people what went on. All of a sudden you see this, worldwide sort of recognition that this is wrong, that this shouldn't be happening, that we need to re-examine our own attitudes. We need to re-examine the role of police use of force. Things that even 10 years ago, people didn't talk about. Black Lives Matter deaths have been going on for generations in the United States. But it takes a moment in time, and this is the moment in time that those attitudes are changing. And I think that applies to the LGBTQ community as well. It's that recognition that we can't live like we lived in the past. We have to change. And one of the ways we change is recognizing what the past was and making that commitment to not relive that past, to not be what we were, but to be, if you will, the Abraham Lincoln better angels of our nature.
Bruce, you said something very interesting, and I think it, we have, the younger generation right now, these high school kids that are, they're activists, they're going out, they're using their voices, but also they're growing up in a time where they're not hiding, they are accepted, they are being embraced. So, what has been an interesting dialogue when you have these conversations? I think it's beautiful. I think it's amazing that we know that they're not having to grow up with that, but what do you say to them? Are they just so shocked that this used to happen? And how did those conversations go?
It's interesting. Because they grow up, let's not pretend like there's still not discrimination and prejudice against LGBTQ people. There is, but they grow up in a world where they can be who they are in a much more open way. They still run into all kinds of reactions and all kinds of, pushback, if you will, and violence at times. But at the same time, I don't think they recognize how pervasive it was, in the past. When you have a high school kid and an older lesbian in her 80s sitting down and talking together, and her telling her story about how she had to hide who she was, how she had to with her partner, pretend that they were relatives, or many lesbians would adopt one another so they could be mother and daughter, in effect, and it's sort of like, you could see their eyes just getting big, the high school kids' eyes getting big, just sort of realizing that they don't have to do that. They can be who they are. They still run into prejudice and discrimination, of course, but they don't run in it to the degrees that, 50 years ago or 100 years ago, you ran into.
In your experience, what are the changing factors that make people change? What makes people move past the hatred? How do we push past that and create this world of understanding that, I think it's great to have these dialogues, but it makes you wonder, when can we not have these dialogues, and when can it just be a world that doesn't exist with those biased views?
That's a tough one. But
Yeah.
again, let me go back to Black Lives Matter. I think seeing George Floyd with a knee on his neck for 9.5 minutes, basically, it made it personal. And I think for these LGBTQ kids in high school and in their 20s, talking to people in their 60s and 70s and 80s, it makes it personal. And I think to me, that's always the key. It's always relatively easy to push it off and say, oh, that's somewhere else, that's not here, or oh, that's somebody else, that's not me. But when it becomes personal, you have to you have to be reflective and look at your own soul and say, who am I? And I think that's what it takes. It's one person at a time, basically. And I think what's so incredible at the moment we're in right now is that recognition has been simmering there for years and years and years. And one video of one Black man for 9 minutes, boom, you've seen the world rise up, and people just say, that could have been me, that could have been my sister, my brother, that could have been my neighbor. That's not acceptable.
And, it's also exhibits. We're going to be having some virtual conferences. We're doing this story
Sure.
also.
Sure.
Why is it important that these are stories that we're also telling? Because clearly there is an audience that we haven't been able to reach yet.
Sure. Yeah. And I think when you walk in most museums right now, you hear the story of the dominant society. And that's an important story, but it's not the only story. And I think it's impingent on museums to tell all the stories and infuse the larger story with all these sub-threads that make it what it is. It's kind of, America is not one thing. It never has been. We tend to have this national myth, that we're exceptional, and in some ways we are. But in other ways, we're this crazy quilt mix of people and cultures, and to try and subsume that under one story just doesn't work. And when you do that, you ignore the stories of all those other pieces. And so I think that's the role of museums today, is to make sure that we're telling all the stories and we're showing how those stories interlace with one another. It really is this tapestry of who we are as a country.
I know we can't describe the entire museum and the entire exhibit, but the entrance, it's moving, it's powerful. Having that be the opening piece that you see when you come.
Right. Yeah. And that was sort of the brainstorm, if you will, of our designer Jessica Dwyer. As you enter the exhibit, you enter a closet. It's a dark, enclosed space. You hear epitaphs being thrown at you. You see images of the clothing. You have a mirror where you can self-reflect on who you are. And then you go through a curtain. And when you emerge from the curtain, you emerge into the room behind me. This bright, lit, colorful space that tells the stories. And each of these hexagons behind me tell the story of different LGBTQ people on Vashon Island. There's also a section that gives a timeline, if you will, of LGBTQ history. You move outside, there's a gender garden where you can sort of identify your own gender along axes, if you will. There's an AIDS memorial garden. It's a beautiful space that Vashon High School students created a ceramic AIDS quilt based on young men on Vashon who died from AIDS. There's active photographs by Diane Shure. And so there's a number of ways that you can interact with this exhibit and learn about the diversity of the history of LGBTQ people on Vashon.
For you going through this, what was something that you took away or that you were, that touched you the most with this?
Well, I sort of two things. One, the stories that came out and the variety and the range of stories that came out was particularly touching. And then seeing the LGBT community that had been so tight and so involved in the island life in the 80s and 90s, but had sort of drifted away into just being part of the community, to sort of come back together and sort of reattach, if you will. That was very powerful to watch that happen, and to see that recognition that the unity that had held the community together in the fight against prejudice, sort of the recognition that that fight's not over. I mean, they've won great victories. I mean, Supreme Court yesterday, another small step on the way, and yet the battle still goes on. The battle's not over.
For people who watch the story or they have a chance to come to the museum, what do you hope they walk away with as far as a new perspective, or what do you want people to gain the most?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I think a recognition that LGBT community has always been a part of Vashon. It's nothing new. It's not. It didn't start in the 70s and 80s with Stonewall. There were LGBTQ people here in pioneer days, through the 20s and 30s and 40s. Difficult to find those stories because of the hidden stories, if you will. But the recognition that LGBTQ people are a part of us and have been, since humans emerged, is an important thing to walk away from this exhibit, understanding that it's a broader part of the Vashon community. Well, there's one great story, and you may not have time for this, but I think you'll love it. There's a rainbow crane screen hanging in the museum. Let me just pop to that and show it to you, because it's pretty spectacular. I don't know if you can see that behind me.
Yes. Wow.
It's a crane screen. There's 1,000 cranes in it. It's a rainbow crane screen. And it was done by an islander, Thomas Hitoshi Pruxma, who is the story of him doing it. He folded these cranes 10 a day. You put them in an envelope and take them to a friend to hold them for him. And so each day he folded 10 cranes until he had 1,000 cranes together. And then he assembled this crane screen at his friend's house. And then when he and his partner got married, he hung the screen behind a curtain, and they had their ceremony, their marriage ceremony. And at the end of the ceremony, the curtains parted, and here was this crane screen that he had done unbeknownst to his partner. And that was his gift to his partner. That's a powerful story.
Wow. I just got goosebumps when you told me.
Exactly.
When you told me that story.
What a story.
That is just, love,
We all look for a partner like that, right?
Right. Love is love, no matter,
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Wow, that is very powerful. How many pieces are there that you have?
Yeah, it's the difficulty with an exhibit like this is there's not a lot of artifacts. I mean, LGBTQ history was largely hidden. There's not a lot of artifacts. The Pride Alliance, when it emerged in the 90s on Vashon, was part of the highway cleanup. They took a section of highway to clean up. They had a sign saying, Vashon Pride Alliance doing this. That sign was mutilated multiple times, shot at, spray painted. One of the members of the advisory committee had actually saved those signs. Every time one would be defaced, she would go pick it up and get a new one and put it up. And so we have a sign like that in the exhibit. You know, but you know, we have the mirrored ball from the dance club, the Lusty Lady, which is a early gay club in the 1950s and 60s in Seattle. But there are relatively few artifacts from LGBTQ history. It's just the nature of a hidden history. And so trying to find that history and trying to tell it. More photographs and things like that, but hard artifacts, difficult to find.
Due to the closure during the pandemic, the exhibit has been extended through at least April of next year. Right now, you can view it online. Thank you for watching Cairo 7's interview with Bruce Holman. I'm Tracy Leong. Stay safe and enjoy the rest of your Seattle Pride celebration.